The cameras were rolling. The audience was settling into the comfortable rhythm of what promised to be an inspiring segment about seniors embracing technology. Frank Petersen sat in the guest chair with the precise posture of someone who had spent 40 years building bridges, his engineer's mind still sharp at 76. But in the next 15 minutes, everything would change. David Letterman would ask one simple question about computers, and Frank would reveal a story so devastating, so expertly crafted by digital predators, that it would silence 300 people and remind a nation that intelligence and experience are no protection against the sophisticated cruelty of modern scammers. Frank looked exactly like Central Casting would order for distinguished grandfather and retired professional. Silver hair combed with military precision, pressed khakis, and a button-down shirt that spoke to a generation that believed presentation mattered. His reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck, and he carried a leather portfolio that had seen decades of important meetings. Everything about him suggested competence, reliability, the kind of man you'd trust to build something that would last forever. He was there to discuss the senior tech literacy program he'd started at the Riverside Community Center, teaching other retirees how to navigate smartphones, computers, and the internet safely. It was exactly the kind of segment David appreciated. Someone turning a personal challenge into community service, finding purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes they'd made themselves. "So Frank, tell us about this tech program you're running," David said, settling into his chair with genuine curiosity. "What got you interested in teaching seniors about computers?" Frank's voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to explaining complex engineering concepts to junior colleagues. "Well, David, when I retired 5 years ago, I realized I was living in a different world than the one I'd worked in. Everything was digital now, banking, communications, even ordering groceries. I figured if I could learn to design suspension bridges, I could learn to use a computer." The audience chuckled appreciatively. This was familiar territory. The challenges of adapting to technological change, the determination of older Americans to stay current and independent. "And you decided to help other people navigate that same transition?" David asked. "That's right," Frank said, but something in his expression shifted slightly. "Though I have to admit I learned about online safety the hard way. I had to become an expert in scams because I fell for the biggest one of all." David's eyebrows rose. In 15 years of hosting, he'd developed an instinct for when a conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. "What do you mean by that?" Frank was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands, which David now noticed were trembling slightly. When he looked back up, the confident engineer's demeanor was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame mixed with anger. "6 months ago, I thought I was smarter than any scammer," Frank said quietly. "I was wrong." The studio had grown attentive. Something in Frank's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a simple story about learning to use email or avoiding obvious phishing attempts. "Tell me what happened," David said gently. Frank took a deep breath, as if preparing to confess to a structural failure in one of his bridges. "It started with my computer acting strange. Pop-ups appearing, programs running slow, the fan running constantly like the processor was overheating. Then one morning, my screen was completely covered with warnings." He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a printed screenshot, holding it up for David and the audience to see. It looked exactly like official Microsoft alerts. Red backgrounds, urgent warnings, even the Microsoft logo. It said my computer had been compromised and was being used to hack government systems. David felt his stomach tighten. He could see where this was going, but he let Frank continue. "There was a phone number on the screen for Microsoft technical support," Frank continued. "As an engineer, I'm trained to solve problems systematically, so I called the number." The audience was completely silent now. David could feel the weight of what was coming. "The technician who answered knew everything about my computer," Frank said, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone reciting facts that still didn't make sense to him. "My operating system, when I'd bought it, what programs I had installed. He had a professional demeanor, technical knowledge, and he spoke English perfectly. No accent that might have made me suspicious." Frank paused. touching his reading glasses nervously. He explained that my computer had been infected with what he called government-grade malware. According to him, cybercriminals had installed software that was using my IP address to conduct illegal activities, hacking federal databases, accessing classified information. David was listening with growing horror, recognizing the sophisticated psychological manipulation that was unfolding in Frank's story. The technician told me that the FBI's cybercrime unit had flagged my IP address, Frank continued. He said if we didn't clean the malware immediately, federal agents would be knocking on my door within hours, and I'd be charged with cyber terrorism. The word hung in the air like a physical presence, cyber terrorism. For a 76-year-old man who had lived his entire life as a law-abiding citizen, the threat must have been terrifying. "So what did you do?" David asked, though he was dreading the answer. "I gave him remote access to my computer," Frank said simply. "He sent me a link to download software that would let him take control of my screen and fix the problem. It seemed logical. I couldn't see the malware myself, but he was the expert." Frank's engineering background had actually worked against him here, David realized. His training to trust experts, to rely on technical knowledge, had made him more vulnerable, not less. "Once he had access, he showed me files on my computer that looked suspicious," Frank continued. "Lines of code I didn't understand, processes running in the background that he said were part of the illegal hacking operation. He opened what he called log files that showed my computer had accessed Pentagon servers, CIA databases, even nuclear facility networks." David felt sick. The scammers had created a complete fiction, using Frank's own computer to generate fake evidence of crimes that existed only in their script. "The technician was very professional about it, Riscours," Frank said. "He wasn't accusatory or threatening. He actually seemed sympathetic, like he was trying to help me out of a terrible situation I'd accidentally gotten into. He said this happened to a lot of senior citizens, that criminals specifically targeted older people's computers because they were less likely to have proper security software." The psychological manipulation was masterful, David realized. The scammers had positioned themselves as Frank's allies against other criminals, making him feel grateful for their help rather than suspicious of their motives. "But then came the part I should have questioned," Frank said, his voice growing heavier. "He told me that removing the malware would trigger an automatic alert to federal authorities. The only way to prevent my arrest was to post what he called security bonds, money that would prove I wasn't involved in the hacking and was cooperating with the investigation." David closed his eyes for a moment. "How much did they ask for?" $47,000, Frank said, the number falling like a stone into water. He said it was temporary, that the money would be returned once the investigation proved I was a victim, not a perpetrator. He even gave me case numbers, reference codes, the name of the FBI agent who would be handling my file. The audience gasped audibly. $47,000 was a lifetime of savings for most people. "Frank," David said gently, "did you send them the money?" Frank nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice again, it was barely above a whisper. "I wired it to what I thought was a secure FBI account. The technician stayed on the phone with me for 4 hours, walking me through the whole process, reassuring me that I was doing the right thing." David was struggling to process the cruelty of what he was hearing. "And then what happened?" "For about a week, everything seemed fine," Frank said. "The technician called me daily with updates on the investigation. He said the FBI was very grateful for my cooperation, that my quick action had helped them track down a major international cybercrime ring." Frank's voice became bitter. "Then one day, the phone number stopped working. The case numbers he'd given me didn't exist in any FBI database. I'd been had." The studio was so quiet David could hear the air conditioning humming. "Frank, I'm so sorry. That money, was it your retirement savings?" "Some of it," Frank said. "But that's not the worst part." David felt his heart sink further. "What do you mean?" Frank reached into his portfolio again and pulled out a photograph. It showed a young man in a cap and gown grinning at graduation. "This is my grandson, Tommy. He's 19 now, brilliant kid. Wants to study aerospace engineering just like his old grandpa." Frank's voice cracked as he continued. Tommy's parents, my daughter Sarah and her husband Mike, died in a car accident when Tommy was 12. I've been raising him ever since, and I promised them on their deathbeds that I'd make sure he got the education he deserved. David felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Frank, please don't tell me. 30,000 of that 47 was Tommy's college fund, Frank said, tears starting to flow. Money I'd been saving for 7 years. Money that was supposed to send him to MIT or Caltech or wherever his brilliant mind could take him. The audience was openly crying now. Several people in the front row had their hands over their mouths in shock. Tommy doesn't know yet, Frank continued. He's a senior in high school, applying to universities, writing essays about his dreams of designing spacecraft, and I have to figure out how to tell him that his future got stolen by criminals who convinced his supposedly smart grandfather to hand over everything. David stood up from his desk and walked over to Frank's chair. Without asking permission, he knelt down beside the elderly man. Frank, he said gently, this isn't your fault. These people are professionals. They study psychology. They practice their scripts. They know exactly which fears to exploit. You're not the first smart person they've fooled, and you won't be the last. But I should have known better, Frank said. I'm an engineer. I built bridges that carry millions of people safely every day. I understand systems, logic, problem solving. How could I fall for something so obviously fake? Because it wasn't obviously fake, David replied. These scammers had your computer model, your operating system information, probably details from data breaches that made them sound legitimate. They created fake websites, fake case numbers, fake everything. They turned your expertise against you. Frank was sobbing now, not just from the financial loss, but from the deeper wound to his identity, his sense of competence, his ability to protect the people he loved. Tommy is everything to me, he whispered. He's all I have left of Sarah and Mike. And he's brilliant, David. His math teachers say he's college-ready already. He dreams of working for NASA, designing missions to Mars, and I destroyed his future because I was too proud to ask for help, too embarrassed to admit I didn't understand my own computer. David looked out at the audience, then back at Frank. What does Tommy say about all this? He doesn't know, Frank repeated. I keep thinking I can figure out how to replace the money, maybe take out a reverse mortgage on the house, sell my car, something. But even if I could come up with $30,000, I can't give him back the time he's lost. College applications are due in 3 months, and financial aid applications require information I don't have anymore. Behind the scenes, David made a decision that would define this moment forever. He looked directly into the camera, abandoning all pretense of entertainment. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, what you've just heard represents one of the most sophisticated and cruel forms of theft that exists. These scammers didn't just steal money. They stole a young man's future and an old man's peace of mind. He turned back to Frank. But here's what I want you to know. Tommy's future isn't destroyed. It's delayed, and that's not the same thing. David reached into his jacket and pulled out his personal checkbook. The movement caused a ripple of surprise through the studio. Frank, what was the name of Tommy's first choice school? Frank looked confused. MIT. He wants to study aerospace engineering? And how much does a year at MIT cost these days? About $55,000, Frank whispered, including room and board. David began writing a check. Well, Tommy's going to MIT, he said simply. 4 years full ride. Because one grandfather's love for his grandson and one young man's dreams are not going to be destroyed by criminals. He tore the check out of his checkbook and handed it to Frank. $220,000. That should cover 4 years at MIT with enough left over for graduate school if he wants it. Frank stared at the check like it was written in a foreign language. David, I can't accept this. This is too much. You're not accepting charity, David said firmly. You're accepting justice. The criminals took Tommy's college fund. I'm giving it back. The audience erupted in applause, but David wasn't finished. He looked back at the camera. If you're watching this at home and you're over 65, listen to me carefully. These scammers are targeting you specifically. They know you didn't grow up with computers. They know you trust authority. They know you're afraid of being seen as burdens to your families, and they use all of that against you." He paused, looking back at Frank, who was still staring at the check through his tears. "But most importantly, if something like this happens to you, tell someone immediately. Don't be embarrassed. Don't try to fix it yourself. These criminals count on your shame and pride to keep you quiet while they steal everything you've worked for." As the show ended and the credits rolled, Frank sat in the guest chair, still holding David's check. The piece of paper represented more than money. It represented the restoration of hope, the validation that his love for Tommy mattered, and the recognition that being a victim of crime didn't make him a failure as a grandfather. The tech support scammers had stolen Frank's savings, but they couldn't steal the most important thing: the bond between a grandfather and the grandson he'd raised, the promise he'd made to his dying daughter, and the dream of a young man who wanted to reach for the stars. That night, Frank would finally tell Tommy the truth about what had happened, and then he'd tell him about David Letterman, about the kindness of strangers, and about how sometimes when the worst things happen, the best of humanity shows up to make things right. Tommy Petersen would go to MIT. He would study aerospace engineering, and someday when he was designing spacecraft to carry humans to Mars, he would remember the night his grandfather's honesty and a comedian's generosity made his impossible dreams possible again.